Okay, so good morning, seniors. Welcome to class. Today we are tackling foundational elements of the mature cybersecurity program or the cybersecurity framework, right? So today we're going to talk about the identity function. So we'll discuss how it's operationalized, how we gain trust, asset visibility, and how we conduct meaningful risk assessments through the same framework, right? So, future leaders that you are, your job is not just to configure firewalls, right? It's understanding what is the center of data management today and how different organizations are all about. So, in terms of an enterprise, we talk about discipline. And we know that cybersecurity is not just a technical function, right? So, before, if you look at how organizations were before, which is on the left side, which are the legacy systems, we were always isolated into silos, right? We used to implement firewalls, servers, and mostly it's the IT team that installed it, and we merely provided the rules, right? The framework shifts this architecture. We said that cybersecurity is an enterprise risk discipline. It's not just technical, right? So remember, the govern function is at the center, right? And we call it the center of gravity. So it tells us how to implement all the other functions of that circle, right? So it allows us to align with always the business, the context of the business, what the business wants to do, and of course, your stakeholders. Now, you see several circles within this particular side, right? So we have to understand alignment, right? If you look at the center of the screen, there's something that we call core assets or core insights. This is like the golden rule. You cannot protect what you cannot see, right? Just like in anything in security, you cannot protect what you cannot see, what you cannot inventory, right? And you cannot assess the risk if you don't know what your assets are, right? You cannot prioritize what assets are important without understanding how the business operates, right? The business environment. And finally, you cannot align that business environment, right, without the center of gravity, which is governance, right? It is always going to be continuous. So there's business assets, there's business environment, and there's governance around it, meaning that we understand what the assets are that are important to the business based on its mission, right? So remember, you cannot protect what you cannot see. You cannot assess risk without understanding your assets. You can't prioritize what's important if you don't understand the business. And you cannot align the business if you don't have some type of governance. Now, we already said that if we understand the strategy, we can align security, right? If we understand the business, we can align the proper security measures to secure it, right? With the organization's mission. Where does it want to go? What it wants to do, right? So context is very important, right? So here you see three areas, right? So the most important one is understanding the organizational mission and its critical objectives. Ano bang importante dun sa business, no? For a bank, for a bank, it's important for a bank to be able to manage the finances, withdrawals, deposits, right? And of course, the different investments if it handles the investments of its clients. So knowing that, we know exactly what to secure, right? We want to make sure that it can properly and securely manage the finances of its clients, right? That's a bank. So that's when we talk about context dictates strategy and how we're going to align based on the mission, right? The same thing, no? Every cybersecurity decision, there are three gravitational pulls to support the organizational mission. First, supply chain, right? You want to understand the services and capabilities of the organization, right? Ano bang ginagawa? Ano ba ang kailangan ng organization, right? What kind of tools, what kind of third-party organizations are supplying, right? So, what external capabilities does the organization rely on? The second is your stakeholders' expectations, right? What do the internal leadership and external partners require? Meaning, what do the executives, higher management expect, right? And of course, there are external partners, right? There are business partners. The third is always legal and regulatory obligations, right? Just like banking system is managed and regulated by the BSP or Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, right? For example, in your university, you have a central mission in education, right? The legal or regulated context that handles what the school does in context is Department of Education or CHED, right? Commission on Higher Education, right? So let's say there is a cloud grading platform. So the university has wants to get, right? That's a dependency. It has a cloud grading platform. So that means that we have supply chain dependencies. We need to get the go signal from our stakeholders, right? And we also need to ensure that it's legal and it follows the rules of CHED, right? Of Department of Education. So all these things, they dictate how we're going to implement this cloud grading platform. From the security, the functionality, right? The testing, everything, right? Those things are important. So, we say that all cybersecurity decisions must filter through these three organizational pulls. From a dependencies perspective, your stakeholders, and naturally, what is legal, right? So once context is set, right? Now that we know the organization, what it does, we must structure accountability. And remember, in our previous class, we talked about accountability means that it's clear governance, right? The strategy comes from our leaders, our executive board, right? They tell us this is our risk appetite, right? We're giving you this much of a budget, right? And this is how we're integrating cyber into the whole risk or enterprise risk program, right? So once the executive board provides that accountability and strategy. Then you have your managers, right? Your managers, they're the ones that implement policies. They're the ones that write. We write policy at the managerial level. We call it implementing policy or enforcing policies, right? Dependent on the organizational context, naturally. If there are changes and threats in technology, and establish the rules of how we communicate, right? How the lines of communications are established. So managers implement policies reflecting the threat landscape. Then finally, the bottom, these are the practitioners. Many of you will be in this realm, right? When you graduate, you'll be executing the different activities, actions, the roles, the responsibilities. You will also have technical authorities because you are in security, no? So remember that strategy comes from your executives and your policies, comes from your managers. And then when we measure how good we're doing, how are we managing the environment, how many vulnerabilities have we looked at, how many vulnerabilities did we fix, those are metrics. They go from the practitioner up to the managers and eventually gets reported to the executives. So there's always this difference, right? Where we talk about defining the organizational risk appetite and tolerance. So the board has to have all the information it needs in order to make decisions, right? The board's most critical job is to define the organizational's risk appetite and tolerance, right? So this means that it's responsible for communicating what is the acceptable thresholds for risks that it wants to take to achieve its business objective, right? You can either be conservative or you could be aggressive. So let's say a 100-year-old bank will have a high conservative risk appetite, right? While an early stage crypto startup might have an aggressive one, right? There's more to lose for a 100-year-old bank than a startup, right? So they're more aggressive, right? Organizations must implement calculations so they can define the risks across departments, right? Cyber risks can sometimes create strategic business value. Let me just take myself out of the... Okay. So, the next is really about visibility, right? You cannot protect what you can't see, right? You can't also manage or govern, right, what you cannot see. So governance allows you to understand what is the blueprint, right? So the identity function, its job is to identify what are those things, what are those assets, what are those information, right? While governance provides the blueprint, the identity function surveys the environment. So this is important because you have to see everything. So visibility is very important, or visibility is imperative. Naturally, you can create rules for something you can't see. So you have to know your footprint. How many servers? How many laptops? Right? How many information types do you have? Where are they? So you look at digital, physical, and human elements, right? Those are really important. Remember, we talked about people, process, and technology. Those are important elements, right? So let's say we were working on your capstone, right? And you were working on the university, how to secure the network or the digital platform. You'd have to understand how many are in the system, how many segments, what is the network, right? What type of information is being transmitted? Where is information stored? Do we use cloud? So there are certain things in the identity function that you have to contend with and remember. So modern assets, what we call our modern assets, is not just around what we see inside an organization. It's also what people have, what people connect with, right? Hardware. In our organization, for example, I can connect to my email through my work laptop, through my tablet, through my phone, right? So already for one user, there's 3 devices I access the network, right? So that's physical endpoints. If your organization has CCTVs or IoTs, right, it also needs to be known how many do you have. And if your organization uses operational technology, if you're manufacturing, so that's important, you need to understand what's inside the facility that you manage in the organization. So those are things, those are physical hardware, right? The second is software. Inside my phone or inside my laptop or inside my tablet, it has to be managed. It has to be clean before I access, no? So the organization must inventory what applications are running on the systems that I use to access our network, right? So that's an example. So it has to know how many applications it has. What type of operating systems? Are they all Windows? Are they all iOS? Are they Linux, right? So understanding what kind of operating systems we have and who our cloud environments are. So we have to draw out that blueprint, right? We have to draw out the blueprint of what that looks like. Because that allows us to determine how data is flowing across the organization, right? So that's hardware and software, right? So we know what physical devices. We also know what type of applications and operating systems. Then the third one is all about information, right? Metadata. So we have to remember, where does critical data, personal identifiable information reside? Is it tagged? Is it encrypted? Is it stored properly, right? So that's the most important. That's really the crown jewels of an organization. Ano ba yung importanteng data? Could be intellectual property, could be personal identifiable information, all of which are critical, right, sensitive information, right? And then the third one or the fourth one that we're looking at is third-party services, right? So external suppliers, third-party services. Do our applications connect via API to other programs? For example, do we have programs or AI systems that connect to, let's say, Claude or ChatGPT, right? So those are external suppliers. There's API, right? Do we have services like ServiceNow, which is really a workflow system, a ticketing system, HR system? Do we have systems like that? Those are third-party services. So most importantly, we map our information assets to data, and the data, the metadata, to understand where critical or sensitive information reside, or where they live. Okay. So when we prioritize how to secure things, right? Once alam na natin kung ano yung important, identify natin yung sensitive, personal, identifiable information, intellectual property. That's what we call crown jewels. Right? Kasi if you do, when you do an inventory, there's going to be a lot of assets and a lot of information. So you cannot prioritize everything. So you have to prioritize based on criticality, right? So for your organization, it's important to what? To contain, right? So not all assets are equal, as it says here, right? So if it's important, classified as critical or sensitive, then we need to prioritize securing that, right? Because if you prioritize every single point of data, then you're going to need larger resources that really don't need any security, that if that information were to get out in the public, it does not cause harm, right? So that's not a priority. It's those things that have a direct impact on the organization. So and that's what we call, and that's where we go into the life cycle management. So when we talk about the life cycle, right, we identify assets to their life cycle, from securely procuring all the way to secure disposal. Okay, so when we get data, we know exactly what to do with them, how to protect, right? We protect data in storage, we protect data in transit, right? So the next one is, how does this all fit together in terms of understanding our landscape, our threat landscape? So there are three areas. If you look at the center, there's assets, there's vulnerabilities, and internal, external threats. So when we talk about assets, remember, you cannot protect what you cannot see, right? And sometimes you have systems that are old, right? Or you have supply chain, right? So when you look at your supply chain, you need to assess those suppliers before we do business with them, before acquisition, because they could be a threat vector, right? And then we also use what we gather from outside the organization, threat intelligence, right? From different forums, right? Integrating or anticipating any adversarial. We get information from the MITRE organization. We get information from the Center for Information Security, right? There are many information sharing forums, right? So those are considered external threats, right? So the center then becomes what we call our inherent risk. So we said that our crown jewels, most important information, we do a risk assessment. So I explained the Venn diagram and what the threat landscape looks like. Inherent risks is in the middle. That means inherent means we haven't put any controls, right? Especially if there's vulnerabilities or internal threats. So knowing what is inherent, we need to determine what we're going to do. Are we going to mitigate? Are we going to accept? Are we going to transfer or avoid? So we understand our threat environment, right? Our landscape, our threat intelligence, we gain from forums. So we extend our footprint, right? We also look at our supply chain. So identify is huge, right? It's a larger, it's not just about understanding data, but also understanding risk, identifying risks, identifying vulnerabilities, identifying threats. That is the identity function. It's a very huge and encompassing function. Then we move to, like I said, once we know what is inherent, right? How do we measure inherent risk? The center of the Venn diagram earlier. We do some calculating, right? So we look at likelihood of attack or exploitation against the impact to our organization. So let's say if our risk is high, the likelihood and high impact, it will go in the red zone, right? Let's say something happens to personal identifiable information. That's pretty high because it's PII, because there's a legal ramification, right? So if the likelihood is high, meaning currently it doesn't have any controls, right? And something happens, nakalabas yung personal identifier, there's a high impact, right? Meaning regulatory will come after us. So we must immediately either we don't use that information, which is called avoid, or we put a control, mitigate, right? So that means everything that's so important that sits with and it has a high inherent risk, we need to determine what we're going to do with it. Let's say it's in the yellow zone. Information is not as critical. System is not as critical. But we apply controls to mitigate or transfer. You can actually fix it or transfer it and say, hey, I can transfer this to insurance. But most organizations don't. They actually try to mitigate. No? And then for systems that are low risk, let's say in vulnerability, even if they get in, they don't get into the organization, they just get into the outer layer, they don't even get into the firewall. That's kind of low, right? So that we accept that, right? It's not really a priority. It has a low likelihood of exploitation, meaning low likelihood of an attack, right? And it has a low impact even if it happened, right? So we don't necessarily prioritize. We monitor the risk, and then we fix when we can, right? Again, we fix when we can. So it's not like we're not gonna do anything about it ever. You have to fix it at some point in time, right? So here's what we say about a realization, right? So there's always this continuous feedback loop, and it's all about resilience, operational resilience, right? We use governance because we set the tolerance. Sinabi ng, we already know that the tolerance and the risk appetite is provided by executives. And then we identify by mapping and creating a blueprint or the footprint. Then we start assessing, right, the threats against what's in our organization. We start calculating likelihood and impact, right? And then we adapt, right? So that means when we continuously do this process, we tell our governance, we tell our internal audit, right? What we need to update in our policies, how we're tracking our assets, and then it continues over and over, right? So, risk assessments is continuous. Everything that we do has a risk assessment component, right? When we do something, when we fix something, we also have to look into our risk treatment plans, right? Our governance strategy. Because of a fix, we might need to update a policy. Because of a change in the environment, we update a policy, right? Or we might have lost some organization, so we need to change assets we're managing, right? And we continue the whole cycle. So again, risk assessment and governance is a continuous feedback loop, right? Provides us operational resistance. So, how do we measure if we're getting better? Remember, we always talked about how we get from tier 1, partial, ad hoc, defined, adaptive, right? The staircase, right? When we talk about identity or identify, it's the same, right? How do we measure if we're getting better with the loop that we're doing, right? Partial means the organizational is reactive, right? It's not coordinated. Nobody is communicating. Maybe the practitioner does not have the information or the policy, right? Or they're not able to do anything or secure the environment because there is no budget, right? The fourth part, which is the higher part of the staircase, right? Meaning, as a security leader, we want to push towards the adaptive and resilient tier, right? Where we have money, we have budget, right? It's aligned with the risk environment, and it aligns with what the executive said was their risk appetite and risk tolerance, right? So that's risk. And risk not just from cyber, but risk in general. And then you have your asset visibility and sharing. So, in partial, we don't have all the information. We don't see all the assets. We don't know. So that's where we talk about limited awareness, right? We don't talk, there's no communication, or if there are, they're siloed, right? When you get to adaptive, when it's really working really well, right? You have visibility of all the information. There's always sharing across the organization, and you understand who your business partners or your third parties are, and you can manage them, right? So each area can be at some portion of the tier, right? Hindi yan all together. Like you could be a partial in risk strategy, but you could be defined in asset visibility, right? Supply chain, right? You could be unaware that you have suppliers, new suppliers that was not communicated but are in the system, so you don't know. So this is not good, right? Because we're not able to monitor and understand if there are risks, right? The most mature one, which is adaptive, is it's consistently acts upon if there are changes in the supplier environment, right? That they are real-time monitoring things. If something happened to Google Cloud or something happened to AWS, we can already immediately we understand what to do and who to contact and what our continuity of operations would be like, right? If we were to not use the third party, right? Because there's an incident or something. So how does this all work, right? So we have to build frameworks. We have to build a roadmap to get from the first tier to the fourth tier, we have to build what we call profiles. You have to start from point A, where you are, and identify, and then map your way out to point B, which is where you want to be, right? So, kanina, we were talking about scoping the business. So, that means understanding, identifying information, right? And then we collect policies, we do our inventories, right? And then, understanding where we are, we create documentation of the current outcomes, right? And then when we do a gap analysis, we look at the difference between where we want to be, which is a tier 4, versus tier 1, right? So that's reality. And then we get to action, to execute. That is really your action plan. So we need to have resources, we have to have the budget, we also have to understand how we're going to improve the posture, right? So we want to bridge the gap so that eventually we are in point B, where our target profile would be. Some organization target profile goes for defined first before they go for optimized, right? That's understandable if they're sitting in ad hoc, no? So as we close, right? Remember that cybersecurity starts with governance, establishing the rules, right? And aligning those risks and enterprise risk, right? It's not just buying hardware or software or buying another service, purchasing another service, or taking on a service, right? So that true resilience, to achieve it, we have to have governance. So we have to establish the rules. How do we engage and how do we take on new suppliers? That's one, right? Do we do the due diligence for our suppliers? Right? The second is eliminate the footprint. You can't defend a digital or physical or human asset you don't know exists. So if you don't know your environment, you cannot protect it. Right? And then you assess continually, right? There's always checking, right? You're always looking at assessing your vulnerabilities, your threat, your internal and external environment for threats, and you're also managing those things that you implemented. So resiliency is only achieved only when security is built into the organization, right? So remember that cybersecurity will always start with a decision by the organization to do or to engage into something. You're not really saying, okay, I want to go ahead and buy, right? It's not a software purchase. So that's it for this particular presentation. I'll see you in the next press.